Hi, everyone. It's Michelle Hickey here from Dennis C. Miller Associates. I want to just welcome you all. It is, I have a minute after 1, and I want to get started. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Um, I'm going to, in a second, introduce our speaker. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you could keep your video off and your uh, microphone muted. We have more than 100 people today, so we'll be taking questions via the chat function of Zoom. So I'll just maybe another minute. We've got a few more people joining. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, and we're really happy you decided to spend your afternoon with us today. Well, I'm going to bring in Greg Nielsen. He's our speaker today for this webinar. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Greg as soon as I keep trying to add more people to the webinar as they're coming. But Greg joined Dennis's firm less than a year ago. We're thrilled to have him here. He's a senior VP with Dennis Miller Associates, and he is also president and CEO of Nielsen Training and Consulting. He has been working with nonprofit organizations for easily more than a decade. He was previously with the Center for Nonprofit Excellence, and he helped grow that organization to serve more than 500 organizations. During that time, he also launched Destination Excellence, which is a 6-month leadership development program for nonprofit executives. It's a peer-to-peer learning program for nonprofit leaders. And he also has experience in public, private, and nonprofit sectors through his work with Green Hill Therapy, a nonprofit specializing in rehabilitative care for children with special needs, and also as the vice president with Bank of America. Greg is also our firm's, well, I don't know about our own firm's military veteran, but he is a military veteran, having previously served as an officer and attorney with the United States Army Judge Advocate General Corps, which is, prior to this, I actually never knew anybody who belonged to that. I only knew it from the television show. So I'm very excited to know Greg's work with that agency. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Government and International Relations from the University of Notre Dame and a JD from Notre Dame Law School. And in 2016, he was named Under 40 honoree by the Louisville Business First publication. So Greg, I am going to find you. And are you unmuted?
I am here, yes.
You're here, wonderful. So Greg will be sharing his screen with us, and we'll let you go.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. I want to thank everybody for joining me on the webinar today. I appreciate, Michelle. Thank you for that generous introduction. I also want to thank Dennis Miller. Dennis is a friend and colleague of mine who has been a mentor to me, and I appreciate that. And the opportunity to be a part of his firm is something that I value highly. I'm thrilled to be with you today on this webinar. I think many of us have been on a number of different webinars over the past several weeks, moving into a couple of months now. But our topic today is managing the virtual board meeting. So I think most of us, now that we are adapting to this new reality of working from home or working remotely with our teams, I've had to come up against the challenge of what do we do when it comes time for our next board meeting? What do we need to do? What will we do if we have an emergency board meeting? How can we convene the team in a way that is productive and allows us to get work done, but it's also understanding of people's different circumstances. And so we're going to talk about some tips and strategies for managing the virtual board meeting today. And then also, before we wrap up, we'll also talk about the board's response and board leadership in times of crisis. So I break this webinar up into a few different parts. You see on the screen there, I break it up into the why, the how, and the what. So as we approach a nonprofit board meeting, as we approach a board meeting in this virtual environment, it's important to start with why. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of the meeting? Then we'll talk about the how. So what are some tips, some strategies, some of the mechanics to make the virtual board meeting productive, to make it effective, to allow you to get the business done that you need to in order to move the organization forward. And then finally, at the end, we'll talk about the what. So if we are meeting as a board virtually, what are some of the key conversations that we can and should be having as a board? What is the board's unique sphere of influence? So what are those areas that the board can make the most immediate impact for their nonprofit organization during this particular time? So we start with the why. I'm a big believer, obviously everyone is familiar with the work of Simon Sinek here. When we start with the why, we think about what is bringing us together as a nonprofit board here. Is this just our regular board meeting that happens to fall during the COVID crisis and we've decided to have it virtually? Is this an annual meeting? Are we trying to facilitate elections of new board members, board officers, re-elections, terms that are expiring? Or is this an emergency meeting? Is there something that is going on within or without our organization, within our community, that necessitates that our board has to come together right now, and we have to do it through this virtual environment? So the choices that we make, the tips that you employ, the strategies that you employ in putting together your virtual board meeting are largely driven by the type of meeting that you're trying to have, whether it's a regular meeting, an election that's going to necessitate a little bit more technology or a little bit more of the mechanics behind the scenes, or if it's an emergency meeting where we have to bring people together on short notice. Before we get into any of the mechanics of the how, I think it's important to touch on the limitations. We have all, over the past several weeks, I would hazard a guess that everyone on this webinar today has participated in a number of different Zoom calls, GoToMeeting calls, webinars, and conference calls, and they are limited. Right? There are things that you simply cannot do in the virtual environment, or that you cannot replicate in the virtual environment that you can when you're face-to-face with someone. It's also important to realize what other limitations may exist when you're hosting a virtual meeting. The first thing you will want to check as a nonprofit leader is to check your bylaws. See if there are any specific provisions, or more specifically prohibitions, in your bylaws about meeting virtually. Are there different types of meetings where you can meet virtually, and are there different limitations or restrictions that your bylaws are placing on you for meeting virtually? For example, some organizations have bylaws that don't allow them to conduct board votes in a virtual environment, or don't allow them to elect new members or re-elect members in a virtual environment. So that brings up the first question of what do we do if we have a nonprofit organization that has bylaws that somehow prohibit us from meeting in the virtual environment? The first thing you'll want to consider is this a provision of the bylaws that there is support at the board level for suspending or amending? So perhaps we can pursue a board resolution in a case like this that allows us to suspend that prohibition within the bylaws for a defined period of time. And you'll want to go through the mechanics of making sure that there is board consensus, perhaps even board unanimity, to change the bylaws. But in the unique circumstances that we find ourselves in right now, if you have bylaws that prohibit virtual meetings, the organization's business still needs to get done. So thinking about how can we be creative, how can we be faithful to our bylaws, but still be able to move forward in a virtual environment. Second area that you want to pay attention to is state law. So every state has slightly different laws as it relates to the ability for businesses and nonprofit organizations to conduct business virtually. Some states, for example, differentiate between video conferences and teleconferences. Some states differentiate between the type of organization. So there are things called sunshine laws. So if you're a nonprofit, for example, that receives government funding, you may be subject to sunshine laws within your state that provide specific guidance and specific prohibitions around how you can meet virtually, whether you can meet virtually. And it's always good to take a look at that state law to make sure that you're in compliance there as well. And then third and finally is governance practice. So it's important to realize that every nonprofit organization has a slightly different experience, has a slightly different culture when it comes to virtual meetings. For some organizations who perhaps have a national board or perhaps have board members that are scattered throughout, virtual board meetings have been part of their rhythm, part of their culture for a number of years, and they're very familiar with the technology and very familiar with how to make it work. Other organizations have never conducted a board meeting in a virtual environment. So it's important to take a look at the limitations of virtual board meetings from your bylaws, state law, and also your governance practice and culture. The virtual environment can be productive, it can be effective, but I will tell you in my experience working with nonprofit organizations, it will stress and challenge the relationship between the executive director and the board chair in brand new ways. So the metaphor that I use is that it's critically important that during this time, the executive director and the board chair are both rowing the boat in the same direction. They have to be rowing together in rhythm, with the board focused obviously on the strategy, the executive and the staff focused on the operations. You know, if you think about the metaphor, what happens if we're in a boat and only one of those parties is rowing? We're going around in circles, right? It's the same exact thing for nonprofit organizations during this time. The rhythm and the cadence of the board has to match the rhythm and the cadence of the executive and the staff. They have to be supporting one another, working together, working in rhythm, working in unison. So as we think about the how do we structure a virtual meeting? How do we make it productive and effective? I think all of us have been on meetings that have had some level of dysfunction over the past couple of weeks, right? We talked about a couple of them at the outset, with perhaps someone not being on mute or someone struggling with their camera. One of the first things that I suggest boards do together before, and this is far in advance of the virtual board meeting, is develop the rules of the road together. You know, there's a saying that says that we own what we help create. And for boards that help create the rules of the road, the boundaries that they're going to live by, it's a lot easier to get compliance. It's a lot easier for the board to adopt those rules, to adopt those new norms as part of their culture. So I recommend a discussion with your board to develop what are the rules of the road going to be. For example, we are going to agree as a board not to multitask during virtual meetings. I think we've all participated in webinars or in different meetings, hopefully not right now, where you're trying to do 5 things at once. You may be checking email, you may be surfing the web, you may be checking and seeing what's going on with your kids in the background. So one of the rules of the road may be, to the extent possible, as a board team, when we're together, we're not going to multitask. We're going to put our full attention on the meeting at hand. Another is that we may follow an organized lineup of speakers. And so I think one of the other potential dysfunctions on a virtual board meeting, on a virtual call, is people speaking over one another. One of the ways to get around that is that we're going to follow a roll call of speakers. And so we will make sure that everybody has an opportunity to speak. Everybody has an opportunity to ask their question and to get their question answered. We're just going to do it in an orderly way with a facilitator so that we make sure we don't talk over one another. Another is that we may agree as a board that we want to show our video, that there is benefit for all of us in seeing each other's faces, and that as a team, that's a norm that we can live by, and that's a norm that we want to adopt for ourselves as a group. So think through, for your organization, and every organization will answer this differently, what are the rules of the road for you all? So what will make for a productive board meeting for your team? Next, select the platform that's going to be best for your team. So one of the questions I get asked a lot and have been asked a lot recently is, what platform should we use for our board meeting? We're all familiar with, there's Zoom and there's WebEx and there's GoToMeetings and there's Microsoft Teams. And the answer to that question is the platform that you should choose is the one that your team can be most comfortable with. So as the executive director, as the board chair, if you have a preference for a meeting or something that you use regularly at work, go with that. If your board is comfortable, if the majority of your board is comfortable with a particular platform, go with that one. Don't let the platform be the determination of whether your meeting is a success or not. Choose a platform that has the types of features that you may need. And most importantly, more importantly than features in my view, is the platform that the majority of your team is most comfortable with. So take a poll of your group. So for example, for your board, in co-creating those norms and developing those rules, ask them, are there particular platforms that you have a higher degree of comfort with, that you already may have an account with, so that you don't have to re-sign up or sign up with a new platform. Next, and this is critically important, is test the technology in advance of the board meeting, with each board member. So the key part of that is it's two parts, right? It's test the technology. So make sure for you as the facilitator or you as the executive director and board chair, the technology is working for you, but also put the time in to test the technology with each board member in advance of the meeting. Nothing kills the momentum at the start of a meeting like a board member who can't access the platform, or a board member who didn't realize that they may have had to download a plugin for their computer in order to access the platform, or may have lost the password for the meeting. The more you can do individually with board members in advance of the meeting, the more likely it is that the meeting can start successfully and can minimize disruptions and can minimize technological difficulties. This is going to take time. So I want to emphasize that and give voice to that I understand this isn't easy. For many of you, you may have small staffs, or you may have no staff, or you may not have a technology person on staff, and it's going to take time to meet with or discuss with each board member whether they have developed a level of comfort with the platform, whether they've been able to sign on, to do a test run, perhaps a test meeting one-on-one with that board member. I understand that takes time, but that's one of the most important, most critical steps you can take to ensure that the meeting occurs successfully. Next is plan the agenda thoughtfully. So when I talk about planning the agenda thoughtfully, obviously you always do that for your in-person meetings as well. The difference in a virtual environment is to think through what is most critical to accomplish in this agenda today. We may not be able to have the traditional or typical type of board meeting that we always have. We may need to streamline the agenda. We may need to focus on fewer things with more discussion rather than trying to get through an agenda of 10, 12 items in the agenda. Think through in advance of the agenda, knowing some of the challenges that the virtual environment provides, what is most critical, what is most important for you to accomplish in this board meeting. Another recommendation I have for nonprofit executives is consider assigning roles. So just because you are the executive director, just because you may be the board chair, doesn't mean that you have to own the entire board meeting. There can be an opportunity here, and I think virtual lends itself particularly to this opportunity to leverage the skills and talents that you have on the board team. So in advance of the meeting, consider assigning roles. Perhaps someone is going to be the facilitator of the meeting, someone who's going to make sure that the platform is set up, someone who's going to set the table for the discussion, set the table for the agenda, make sure that individuals have an opportunity to speak and be the one to facilitate the conversation. Another opportunity for a role is the secretary. So you as a group may choose to record your virtual board meeting with the consent of your board members, or you may choose to have a secretary, someone who takes notes during the meeting, a note taker, minute taker. A chat monitor. So if your board, for example, like we're doing today in the webinar, elects to use the chat feature in the webinar, in the board meeting, have a board member assigned as a chat monitor who's just keeping an eye on the questions that are coming in, the individuals on the board team who may have something to say, who may be raising their hand or who may be asking to be called on at a particular point. But having someone who's dedicated as a chat monitor can take that off of the lap of the board chair, can take that off of the responsibility of the executive director and allow them to focus more on the substance of the meeting. And then finally, you can have someone who is dedicated to technical support. So if, for example, you have someone who is particularly computer savvy on your board, or you have a staff member who is computer savvy, you can invite them into the board meeting and ask them to provide technical support on the chat feature for anyone who may be having trouble. Perhaps their volume cut out, or perhaps their signal cut out, or they may need to do something. So just a couple of roles. And again, you can define additional roles for your team, but I encourage you, as a way to promote board engagement, and as a way to facilitate an effective online virtual board meeting, consider assigning roles. Also consider whether an external facilitator may help. So if your board is having to have a really thorough conversation, a really difficult conversation, perhaps this is a situation where you may benefit from having a facilitator, an external facilitator, to help manage the overall agenda and keep the conversation moving in a productive fashion. When we think about the how, think about beginning the meeting intentionally. You know, there's plenty of studies out there. There's lots of research out there that particularly for a Zoom meeting, particularly for a virtual meeting, you will never have more attention from your board members than you will at the outset. Think about how you plan to begin the meeting. I strongly encourage you to begin with a check-in of your board. How are you holding up? How can we support each other as a board and a staff team, as an organization? How can we support one another? What is the purpose of this meeting? Gaining clarity on that up front. And then being really clear and intentional with your board members about what actions will we take during this meeting and what decisions will I be asked to make as a board member. So the more you can tell board members up front what to expect from this virtual meeting, particularly if it's your first go round. How are we doing? How can we support one another? What is our purpose in coming together today? And then what actions do we expect to take? And what decisions are we going to ask you to make as a board during the course of this meeting? Another recommendation I have is to minimize presentation and maximize discussion. So if you're having a virtual board meeting, sometimes the temptation is for the executive director or for the board chair to do all of the talking. Because of some of the challenges of managing dialogue and conversation and keeping people from talking over one another, sometimes that leads to a dysfunction. Sometimes that leads to a temptation to do all the talking ourselves. Rather, a virtual meeting is a great opportunity for discussion. So again, back to streamlining that agenda, focusing on what's most important, and deliberately peppering the agenda with 2, 3, or 4 questions that you want and need the board members to answer and address during the course of that meeting, and then facilitating that dialogue, facilitating that conversation. Also, you want to monitor the energy level. So just as you would if you were in the boardroom, just as you would if you were in a staff meeting or any other type of group encounter, monitor the energy level. And if you get to a point where the material has been heavy or the conversation has been heavy, consider taking a break, giving your board a 5-minute opportunity to catch their breath, a 5-minute opportunity to stretch their legs a little bit, because this is brand new for lots of them as well, sitting in front of a computer screen, trying to have a conversation, trying to do the business of the board. So keep an eye on that energy level of your board team. It's really the virtual platforms give you lots of different tools and lots of different opportunities to capture feedback from your board in real time. So as you're weighing something, and you may use this for formal votes, or you may use this just informally to take the pulse of the board on a particular issue. Do we need to spend more time on this? Are we done with this? Should we move to the next agenda item? Does anyone have anything else to say? Things like that. There are polling features in platforms like Zoom and like GoToMeeting, options to raise a hand. So technology features there that allow you to capture the pulse of the board, allow you to capture the thoughts of the board in real time. So to the extent those features exist, to the extent that you can manage those features without interfering with the conversation and the dialogue, I encourage you to try to capture the board's feedback and pulse in real time. And then you see the picture, this is one of my favorite slides, of engage the elephants. So here is another temptation when it comes to virtual board meetings. Because of the challenges of managing the platform itself, because of the challenges of making sure that everybody is engaged and signed on, sometimes we tend to postpone the difficult conversations. We tend to say, you know what, this isn't a good conversation for us to have on a virtual board meeting, so let's just kick the can down the road. Let's just push it off until we're able to meet again. And at that point, any conflicts that have arisen or any, really sticky subjects or elephants in the room that exist, we'll address them back when we can get together as a board team. And I highly discourage that. even if you have to dedicate half of a board meeting, an entire board meeting, to a really critical, difficult conversation, and it has to be done in the virtual environment, do it. The benefits of engaging that as a team, having productive conversations, and allowing your executive director and allowing your staff to have guidance from the board on these particularly tricky issues is valuable. There's value in that conversation. There's value in addressing the tricky stuff, the elephants in the room, even when you have to do it virtually, rather than giving in to the temptation to just push it off for another day, because we all know, and we've all done it, that's really easy to do. We don't want to have a difficult conversation. Conflict may be difficult. We want to just push that off to another day. Sometimes that other day leads to the dysfunction or the conflict compounding and growing and exponentially growing. And then you also want to secure and record commitments to action and steps. So we talked about how to begin the virtual meeting. This is how we want to end the meeting. We want to be very clear, even if we have to do around the room, going through and calling on individual board members one at a time, as we did at the beginning. Secure commitments and record them. So who is going to do what, by when, and who do they have to report back to? And then finally, solicit feedback. So you have your board members on the call, you have them on the virtual meeting, ask them the question, how did this work for you? What were some of the challenges that you experienced in this board meeting? How can we as an organization better support you as board members for our next board meeting? What would you like to see? What can we do differently? What should we do the same? And what should we copy from the meeting we just had? So soliciting that feedback, capturing that feedback, it's also a way to promote board engagement. Show that you're listening to the board. Show that you're sensitive to the challenges that they may have in this time, in this environment, and that you're also willing to accept constructive feedback and integrate their thoughts and suggestions in future meetings. So now I want to transition. We started by talking about why are we meeting as a board in this virtual environment. Now we talked about the how. So what were some of the mechanics, the tips, and the strategies that we talked through? And finally, I want to talk about the what. So what is it that your board can and should be engaging in right now? I will share this story without obviously mentioning the organization's name. I talked to a board just last week, as a matter of fact. And this was a board that was highly disengaged. The executive director was extremely frustrated with the board, had not heard from board members throughout the COVID-19 crisis, and really was at her wit's end. And I was speaking with the board and facilitating a conversation and asked them, I said, what has led to the disengagement? Why have you disappeared during this time as a board? And the answer that came back from board chair, with all sincerity and authenticity, was we just didn't know what to do during this time. This felt like more of an operational challenge where the staff was scrambling and working day to day on the operations of the organization. And as a board, we just didn't know what to do, where to plug in, what were some of the things that as a board we could be doing that would not get in the way of the efforts of the staff. And so as a result, we stepped back. And that's a common, there's no judgment attached to that. That's a common response for many boards. So I've tried to put together some thoughts around how can a board productively engage during times of crisis? And so that's the what. So if we talked about how to have a virtual meeting, what are some of the topics that can and should come up during these virtual meetings? There was a recent article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. You see the source on the bottom of this slide that really framed the conversation well. And it asked, first of all, as a nonprofit leader, as a board member, what type of organization are you during this crisis? There are organizations that are hibernators, meaning they have had to completely shutter their operations. They are completely closed. I'm thinking, for example, of arts organizations or museums or organizations that physically cannot operate during this shutdown. Then on the flip side, there are organizations that are responders. So if you think of organizations, health and human services, healthcare organizations, food banks, organizations that are on the front lines each day, they are responders. So they are, they're having to address a whole different set of challenges than those that are hibernators. And then third, and probably most organizations are some combination of those, or a hybrid organization. But it can be an interesting way to frame the dialogue with and for your board to talk about what kind of organization are we? Are we a hibernator, a responder, or a hybrid? And what does that demand of us as a staff? And what does that demand of us as a board? Think about the rich conversation that you could have as a staff, and think about the rich conversation that you can have as a board and with your board, just talking through what type of organization are we and what does the needs of the time demand of each of us during this period. And second, the roles of the board never disappear. So just because we are operating virtually or just because our organizations may be shut down, the board still has three key roles. The board is still responsible for setting organizational direction. The board is still responsible for providing oversight and support and ensuring adequate resources. So I want to take a minute on that second bullet point and focus on that word support. So in preparation for this webinar and other webinars on similar topics that I've led, I put out on my social media a question to nonprofit executives. And the question was a simple one. It was, what is the most helpful thing your board members could do or should be doing for you right now? Simple question. What is the most valuable thing a board member, a board chair could be doing for you right now? Overwhelmingly, and I was shocked by the response, maybe I shouldn't have been, overwhelmingly the response was around some version of support. Reach out, ask how I'm doing, tell us we're doing a good job, share encouragement, ask how you can help as a board member, how you can support our efforts. Overwhelmingly, the responses I got fell somewhere squarely in the middle of providing support, either emotional support, financial support, or just checking in on us as a staff team. So I share that with you. If you're a board member, if you're an executive director, highly encourage you to share that with your board members as well. And then ensuring adequate resources, we'll talk more about what that looks like in this environment as well. Just briefly, board legal and fiduciary duties don't disappear during times of crisis. So for the board that may be disengaged right now, or the board that may have gone into hibernation itself, it's always useful to respond and to inform them that they still do have legal and fiduciary duties to the management of the organization. Those are the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, the duty of obedience. So that as decisions are being made by the organization, by the board itself, that they are still maintaining that level of information that they need. They're still consuming the information they need in order to make sound decisions. They're still avoiding conflicts of interest, even though we're in a challenging situation right now. Those legal and fiduciary duties don't disappear. So I mentioned to you earlier that there are a variety of ways that boards can and do respond during crisis. I put this slide together as a way of just displaying that boards tend to go to one extreme or the other in times of crisis. They tend to be like the board that I described for you earlier, either highly disengaged, meaning they completely shut down during a time of crisis and they disappear. Or on the flip side, they tend to be highly engaged, meaning they may even blur the lines between board and staff. In their zeal and their zealousness to do something for the organization, they may step over boundaries. And so there's not necessarily always a positive and a negative connotation associated with engaged and disengaged. Clearly at the top right-hand quadrant, where you see in green, an engaged board that's acting positively is fantastic. That's the ideal. That's what we all want, right? You can also have an engaged board that's acting negatively, meaning they may be acting rashly. They may want to immediately furlough employees. They may want to take all sorts of rash actions that you as the executive director may know in your heart are not in the best interest of the organization. That's an opportunity to focus the conversation on gratitude for their engagement, but also helping to redirect that engagement from the negative to the positive. And then obviously what we want to avoid is down in the far left, which is the disengaged board that is still acting negatively. That can be obviously very dispiriting and damaging to the morale of the organization. So what should and what could a board be focusing on in this time? I like to share with boards that times of crisis lend themselves particularly to the following bullet points that are within their sphere of influence. So each of these things are squarely within the board's responsibility, squarely within the board's sphere of influence. The first being safety and support. So at a high level, Are we taking the precautions necessary as an organization to protect and support our staff, our volunteers, and those that we serve? Do we have adequate plans and policies in place? And we'll talk about a few of those common plans and policies that boards can and should be talking about. What's our communication plan? How are we getting messages out to the community? What is our messaging? What are our talking points? How can we as a board amplify those talking points? Finance, we'll talk in depth in a minute about the board's role and what the board can be looking at in terms of the financial reports. And then equity. Equity is one that is particularly important during a time of crisis, to make sure that as decisions are being made for the organization, that the board is taking into account the needs of all of the staff members, that as decisions are made, particularly or perhaps around working from home, for example, are we taking into account the different levels of technology that staff members may have at home, the different work setups that they may have, the different needs that they may have in terms of work hours and flexibility there. So again, the board's sphere of influence, the board should be looking at things like safety and support, plans and policies, communication, finance, and then making decisions through a lens of equity. I give you the following strategy framework for boards because decisions will come up frequently in times of crisis. And in a virtual environment, it can be helpful to have a framework in front of the board or have a framework that you use to make decisions when difficult choices have to be made. So you see at the top left in green, some decisions may be a current priority. It may be highly relevant. This was in our strategic plan. It's still relevant. It's still a current priority, and we absolutely have to move forward with this. You move over to the right. We have something that may have been in our strategic plan. It may have been part of our core strategy, but for whatever reason right now, our bandwidth, our capacity, our operations, we just can't do it. So we're going to put that to the side. We're going to call that a decision that's a pause and resume when the crisis ends. So we're not giving it away. We're not saying that we will never do it. We're just saying that, you know what, right now we need to press pause on that piece of our strategy, that piece of our strategic plan. Third is what I call an emerging priority. And this framework comes to us from the Center for Community Investment. So if you want to look this up, they have a fantastic article around it. An emerging priority is something that we didn't contemplate in our strategic plan. But guess what? We're all living through uncharted times, right? We're all living through a new time where there may be an emerging priority, something that our organization didn't contemplate in the past, but is suddenly very much in our present and very much necessary, and we need to invest in. We're going to call that an emerging priority and devote the resources necessary for that. And then finally, it is box 4, which is ideas that may pop up that we're just not sure about. They have unknown status. Maybe they need more data. And for right now, in a time of crisis, we're going to honor the idea, but we're going to let it go. Perhaps we'll revisit it, perhaps we won't, but it's something that right now, based on our resources and our limited bandwidth, we're going to honor and release. So when we talk about safety and support, it's important to think through what aspects of this crisis impact our organization. What are our greatest vulnerabilities? What are the scariest questions that we could be asked? When you think about a virtual board meeting and you think about promoting discussion and promoting conversation, how about that one for a question, right? If we were to ask and put in front of our board, if we had to stand in front of a podium and face the community today, what are some of the scariest questions that we could be asked? And let's tackle those as a board team. Let's have a conversation around those questions and figure out how we're going to mitigate some of those risks. How can we prevent the worst case scenario? How can we celebrate the success and the progress that we are making during this time? So again, thinking through from a safety and support, again, squarely in the board sphere of influence, how can we use these topics to promote board engagement even during a virtual meeting? Business continuity. I am fielding a lot of questions lately from nonprofit organizations that have discovered that either they don't have a business continuity plan or their business continuity plan needs to be revised or revamped because of this time and a vulnerability that this time has shown them. And so there are 4 essential elements of any business continuity plan. The first is a communications plan. So if our business is disrupted, who speaks for the organization? How do they speak? What do they say? How do we amplify that message? How do we define what are essential functions for our organization? How do we make that determination and weigh that balance with programs and services that we may need to cease or let go? And then finally, what is our plan to resume normal business activities? Remote operations policy is another area that the board can be involved in, establishing clear expectations, training managers on how to lead virtually. So how many of us ever went to school or attended a training seminar on how to lead in a virtual environment or how to lead a team remotely or virtually? That can be something that can be challenging for even the most experienced managers out there. So what type of training can you solicit, can you acquire for your managers on how to lead virtually? What are technology programs and apps that we may need for the organization during this time? And again, keeping in mind issues of equity. Communications plan. So the board could be involved in helping you to draft and refine your communications plan, which could include a media strategy and press kit, particularly if you're a first responder type organization. Logistics for an emergency board meeting. The time to plan for an emergency board meeting is when you don't need the emergency board meeting, not when you're scrambling at the last minute to pull everybody together. What are our key stakeholder contact information? So if we needed to reach everybody in short order, could we do that? Our essential policy statements, and then frequently asked questions. Financial management. So obviously many boards are rightfully concerned about the finances of their nonprofit organizations. Executive directors similarly concerned about the finances. 5 areas that the board can be involved in when it comes to financial management. First is understand your cash position. Give your board the tools, have a discussion around what is our current cash position. Very simple formula that you can use for that is your current ratio. So cash in the bank divided by your monthly expenses, right? That's going to give you a ratio that shows what is your current cash position as an organization. You can expand that to your intermediate cash position and look at it over a little bit longer period as well. Second is understand what has happened to your revenue stream. So for many nonprofit organizations, there may be fee for service, there may be event revenue, there may be grants. What has happened to your revenue streams as a result of this crisis? Certainly something for the board to pay attention to. Making sure decision-making is balanced, voices are heard, and that the board has a voice when it comes to key policy issues or key pieces of legislation that impact the organization. The board also is responsible for mitigating fundraising loss in partnership with the staff. Ways you can do that are keep your donors informed. You may want to explore asking permission of donors if there are restrictions on particular gifts. You may want to ask permission to lift those restrictions. Consider hosting online auctions or events. Investigate new grant opportunities. Thank your donors. Ask for a one-time gift. And then at the very end down there, you see planned giving. So this is a time when people are thinking about their mortality, rightfully so. People are contemplating what happens in the future. For those of your donors that you're close to, those donors that you feel comfortable having conversations with, this can be a time to pay attention to your planned giving efforts and to maybe double down on those planned giving efforts. Before we wrap up, a couple of hot topics that are, and then I'll take questions at the end. A couple of hot topics that I do want you to be aware of is 2 key pieces of legislation. I'm sure many of you have heard plenty about those to date are the Families First Act and the CARES Act. The CARES Act, many of you have been involved in through the Paycheck Protection Program, which was open for nonprofit organizations. I do want to draw your attention, though, to within the CARES Act, the charitable giving incentive, because there was a change made to tax policy that benefits nonprofits by providing an incentive for charitable giving. So that the incentive creates a new above-the-line deduction, which is universal or non-itemizer deduction applying to all taxpayers for total charitable contributions of up to $300. The incentive applies to cash contributions made in 2020 and can be claimed on tax forms starting next year. So again, there were a lot of different provisions of the CARES Act, and certainly we can't go through all of them today, but the one to pay attention to for your charitable giving is that new incentive for that above the line deduction. And then finally, donor advised funds. So for those of you who may not be familiar with donor advised funds, those are gifts that have already been made to an account that is held either at a community foundation or at a commercial institution. The donor has already received the taxable benefit by making that contribution. So it can be largely insulated from a lot of the economic changes or a lot of the economic challenges that the donor is facing right now. So if you have donors, givers within your network, within your circle who have given previously through donor advised funds, now may be a time for a targeted conversation there around how best to leverage those gifts and whether they might consider making another gift now from their donor advised fund. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit here, and I want to talk before we part about fostering board engagement. We've talked about the mechanics of the virtual meeting, and we've talked about the types of things boards can and should be discussing during this time. Here are a couple of just parting tips from my perspective, and then we'll open it up to any questions that you may have. First is thoughtfully manage the virtual meeting. Like we talked about throughout in the how section, think through the agenda, think through who is going to do what, assigning roles. Do you need to bring in someone from the outside to help the mechanics go more smoothly? How can you put another way, how can you put your board members in a position to succeed in the virtual board meeting? Second, it is absolutely critical that there be strong leadership from the board chair. Board members are looking right now to the board chair for a tone setting, for a partnership with the executive director and the staff. They're going to take their cues during times of crisis from the leadership of the CEO, the executive director, and the leadership of the board chair. They're going to be looking at both of those parties and seeing how aligned are they, how are they working together, what can we do to promote that type of culture. And then next, focus on small actionable steps. So for some of the exasperated nonprofit executive directors that I've talked to who may be frustrated with their board's lack of engagement during this time, I've talked them through focusing with the board on small actionable steps. So what are the really actionable, specific things that you can ask of individual board members that will help you during this period of time? Avoid the broad generalities. Avoid the, we really need your help during this time, or we really need you to plug in during this time. As a board member, that doesn't always tell me exactly what's needed of me or where I can be most helpful. Balance committees versus the full board. So for every organization is going to answer this slightly differently, but are we more effective as a team right now in this virtual environment? Are we more effective working as a full board, or are we more effective continuing to work through our existing committee structure? Have that conversation with your board team, perhaps when you're setting the rules of the road that we talked about at the outset. Are we better off in committees right now, or are we better off in the full board, or some mixture of the two? And then finally, examine your meeting frequency. I'm a lawyer by background, so I'm not one to tell you to disregard your bylaws. But if your bylaws, for example, say that your board meets once a quarter, once every 6 months, and you find yourself, because of this crisis, needing more support, needing more engagement from the board, perhaps it's a time to examine whether it's also time to meet more frequently as a board, or less frequently. Perhaps you're meeting too often and you just need more time to get the work done. Examine the meeting frequency. I want to thank everybody for your participation on the webinar today. I have my contact information there. I appreciate the introduction from Michelle. I'm honored and thrilled to work with Dennis Miller and all that he does in the executive search field and all that he does in the board and leadership development field, and also through my own company working with boards, working on strategy, strategic planning, and organizational development. For those of you who may be podcast listeners, I also host a podcast called Nonprofit Vision that you can find either on my website or on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. All of my contact information is there. I welcome your questions now, and any questions that we don't get to now, I will certainly be happy to follow up via email or via phone conversation, etc. Michelle, can I turn it back over to you for any questions that have come in?
Yes, Greg, thank you so much. There was so much good information in that, and I've been getting messages. Everyone's been asking if they're going to get a copy of this video. So I just want to let you all know that, yes, I've been recording this, and I will be circulating the link to the video later this week. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box. You can either send your question to everyone, or if you want to keep it private, send it just to Dennis Miller, because I'm using his account today. But I have a couple of questions that have come in so far.
Okay.
One participant has asked if you have any specific thoughts about New Jersey state laws regarding meeting via video?
I am, I want to be sensitive to the fact that I know there are participants on the webinar from all different states, all around the country, not just New Jersey. I don't have specific information right now about New Jersey, but that's something that I could very easily answer. So I could, if that poster wants to follow up with me by email, or Michelle, if you want to
Okay.
share that poster's email with me, I would be happy to respond with the New Jersey specific answer there.
Okay, will do. Another question came in on, it says on financial management. Do you have any comments about using reserves to sustain operations, and also about using GoFundMe during this time?
I think first you would want to take a look at what is your reserve policy. You know, I think most organizations that have a reserve or have a, some form of reserve account have policy language around that specifies the conditions under which they can access those funds. For organizations that are fortunate enough to have reserves, assuming the board agrees, I don't see anything wrong with dipping into reserves during a period of crisis like this. This is the rainy day that many of you were contemplating when you put that rainy day fund together. And if not now, when? This is a time when unemployment is skyrocketing, when nonprofits are being faced with tremendous demands, both on their staff, on their finances, on their programs. I would argue certainly do it responsibly, certainly do it with the approval of the board, and do it in accordance with any policy language that you have on the reserve. But assuming those are met, this is not a bad time to dip into those reserves.
I'm getting a lot of people asking about New Jersey information, so maybe
Okay.
A little blog post is in order.
I could do a blog post, or I think everybody who registered probably registered with their email. So when we put out the
Yeah.
email message after the webinar, Michelle, perhaps I can give you a blurb about New Jersey law relative to the open meetings.
I actually had a question that occurred to me, and I'm just wondering what your thinking is. What are your predictions with regard to in-person versus virtual interaction going forward? I think that distancing is going to be a reality for a long time, but do you think that there are going to be some permanent alterations in how we do business?
I think there will
forward?
certainly be permanent alterations in the way we do business. I think that there will be permanent changes in terms of our concept of what can be possible remotely. So, what does our workforce look like? What does our staff look like? I think all of those conversations are going to be with us for a long time. And I think that the virtual board meeting and getting together virtually is going to be with us for quite some time, if not permanently.
Mm-hmm.
I think that even when restrictions are lifted, you are going to have board members who, either because of preference or because of health conditions, don't feel comfortable meeting in person. And so I think the effective nonprofit boards, the highly effective nonprofit boards, are going to say, we don't want to lose these board members. So we're going to have to take a new approach. We're going to have to take a flexible approach when it comes to meeting. But on the flip side, there's tremendous value in being together as a board, as a team, building that camaraderie, building that morale. Even if it's an annual board retreat, I do tons of board retreats. There's an energy in the room, and there's an energy that comes from being physically present with one another that is hard to replicate virtually. And so I always hope and pray that that in-person meetings are our standard.
I have a question actually from the gentleman who's going to be leading our next webinar next week, which I think he's helping us to make a segue here. He asks, does the board chair have a special responsibility to watch for the needs of emotional support and self-care of the CEO? Which is interestingly very similar to the title of next week's webinar.
And we're going to talk about next.
We're going to have to talk about that next.
Absolutely. That is a fantastic question from a fantastic webinar leader. Yes, absolutely. That partnership, I argue that the relationship between the board chair and the executive director is the most critical relationship in the organization, in good times and in bad, in crisis and in everyday times. But particularly in times of crisis, it is vital for the board chair to check in and be an ear of support, even if it's just a pat on the back, even if it's just I see what you're doing and I appreciate it. It doesn't have to be moving mountains. It's as much about the emotional connection between the chair and the executive director as it is about tangible actions and activities.
All right. Well,
I think the guy next week will probably have a lot more information, a lot more detail.
I think so. So if you want to bring up the slide with the, because someone just asked if we could send out invitations to the next education meeting, and we have been circulating that information. Here's the full list. You can access registration either through one of Dennis's emails or social media posts, but also you could see at the bottom of this slide, which will be sent to you as part of the recording, to visit denniscmiller.com/board-leadership-institute/webinars, and you'll see this entire list of webinars. And next week's webinar is 10 self-care musts for supervisors in the age of coronavirus. So I hope you'll all be signing up. I think we've got about 60 or 70 people coming to that already. I want to thank Greg again. This was a terrific webinar. And like I said, I've already gotten 15 or 20 emails saying, please send me the recording. So I think this is information that, oh, you just got some applause, I see, from one participant. So I think this is something that people are going to return to and get a lot of value out of.
Hopefully it's a conversation that you can bring back to your organization, back to your board.
All right. Well, thank you, Greg.
It was my pleasure, Michelle. Thank you.
Our pleasure too.
Thank you to Dennis Miller as well for offering this platform.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Dennis. And take care, everyone. Have a great day.